Earlier when he said that Westside is a church that's doing a lot of things. We have a lot of things coming up and going on. The things that he mentioned are going to be exciting, and I know there's more down the road with Christ Teens and other things that are ahead of us. And we certainly look forward to that, look forward to doing that together. That's one of those things that we enjoy being together on. When it comes to being together, Lenore and I aren't always together on how we remember things. And I'm going to just confess things right off the bat. She's usually right when it comes to that. And so this first illustration that I'm about to give, she said I've already given. I don't remember it. So you're going to get it again if she's right, and she probably is. But, you know, my thought is a good illustration, you got to use it more than once, right? That's definitely a good thing. This happened when we were in Cincinnati. It was the first house that we owned there, and we had just put it on the market, and we're trying to sell it. If you've been involved in that, engaged in that before, you know what that's like, trying to get everything fixed up and all the little problems that you've been putting off for years. You know, you got to straighten them out so that they look right, caulk the windows, do those things to get the house ready to sell. And then there's always, it seems like when the agent wants to come and show the house, it's the worst time, right? I mean, it's always when you're the least prepared and that kind of a thing. And that's what happened early on when we were trying to do this. It just so happened Lenore and the kids were elsewhere. I don't remember where they had gone or what they were doing, but they were elsewhere. And I was at home by myself, it was in the morning, getting ready to go into my office, and I got the phone call. Hey, got an agent wants to show your house, and they'll be there in a couple hours. Is that okay? Well, no, it's not okay. The house isn't anywhere near ready to show, but you can't say that, right? You want people to come and look at your house. So, yeah, okay, we'll make it happen. So I went furiously through the house. And you're going to think I'm terrible, but shoving things in closets, putting blankets over piles of toys and clothes and kind of stacking them so that they look like they go that way. I was running the sweeper, wiping down counters. I mean, I was flying through that house. And then I got to the kitchen. That was going to take a while. Lenore had one of her giant feasts that she had made for church or something along those lines the night before. And if you've seen the amount of work that goes into making one of those feasts, you'll understand why she would have left the dishes to do for the next day, because she is completely beat after she does that. And so it's Monday morning, and I mean the dishes are just running over. And I'm thinking, there's no way I'm going to be able to get that done in time to show this. So I got an ingenious idea. I brought the wheelbarrow around to the back door. And I loaded those dishes in the wheelbarrow and pushed them out into my little storage barn that I could lock. And that's what I did. I took the dishes out there and put them out there. Wiped down the counter, swept the floor, and we were good to go. Lenore's like, where did all those dishes go? Yeah, about those. It was interesting because when the people came, the house looked clean. It really did. It looked great, but it wasn't. Right? If you had dug through not very far down, if you had looked into the corners, if they had opened a closet, they had realized, wow, somebody cleaned this house in a hurry. And it looks clean on the outside. If you stand in the open doorways and look at the rooms, they look fine, but they weren't clean. And it's a great illustration because it's what we do with our lives a lot of times, isn't it? We pretty up those areas that people can stand in the doorway and see, but we hide the mess. That's exactly what I did. And I want to propose in this lesson, as we look at the miracle that Jesus did at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, I want to propose in this lesson that maybe, just maybe, it's that mess that as Jesus shines through it, people are able to see his glory. We want people to see us all put together and prettied up. But maybe it's the mess that when he shines through, it enables others to see God working through us. It enables them to see the supernatural working in the natural. And we're gonna share a little more about that today. The wedding of Cana in Galilee is an interesting miracle. It's unique, unlike any others that Jesus have done. Go ahead and take us to that next slide. And it's a time when we get to see the social Jesus. We get to see his family engaging in activities that we don't see at any other time. We get to see them working together as a family as they go to this wedding feast. And we don't know who got married. We assume that it was either a family member or a close friend of Mary. It mentions that Jesus' mother was there. And so we assume that it was either a family member or a close friend. Cana was a little ways from Nazareth, where they would have had to travel a considerable distance when you think in terms of walking and riding animals. And so you lean a little more towards it probably being someone in the immediate family. Again, we don't know them and we're not told who it is. But it's someone that's special. Jesus is there. His mother is there. His disciples are there. We don't hear anything about his father. What do we guess that's going to tell us about his dad? We assume that Joseph passed away while Jesus was a child. And this kind of reinforces that theory that Joseph didn't survive up until this time. And so it was just Jesus and his mother. And Jesus would have been considered kind of the man of the house at this point. As they go to this wedding. And they're at a feast. Feast was a big part of the wedding back then. It's kind of an afterthought now. The ceremony is the big part, and then we go to the meal afterwards or the refreshments afterwards, whichever we choose. Then it was a big part of the wedding. It was woven throughout the ceremony. We don't know a lot about it, but we know that the weddings back then took up to a week to make that, to go through that whole process. And if you've planned a wedding recently, you'll be thankful that we do that differently, right? The better part of a week, they would be involved in activities and family activities and in sitting around with the guests and enjoying meals, plural, together. And it was during this time, because wine was their drink of celebration, that they would have expected there to be plenty of wine, plenty of beverage to engage in or to partake in. In those days, water and wine was about it on the drink list. That's about all you had. Some would have had milk on hand, but that wasn't considered to be preferable. Water or wine was about it. And there are a number of times that the Bible mentions both of those. Water was considered common. It was what you drank when you were thirsty. Wine was what you drank when you were celebrating something. And so that's what they had. That's what they had on hand until, at this wedding feast, the wine ran out. Let's read with me in John chapter 2, starting in verse 1. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so. The master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned to wine, though he did not realize where it had come from. But the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. A couple of questions that I think we beg to be asked in this is first of all, Jesus, it says his disciples were there. They had been invited to come. John only gives us 4 of those disciples who had become his disciples at that point. And it was likely that it wasn't the entire group of 12, although, again, we're not told for sure. So some of his disciples were there. John, in either case, would have been one of them. And this was memorable to him as he thinks back. Remember, he's writing this many years after Jesus was departed. He's an old man, and he's remembering what took place, and this was something that stood out to him. Because it was the first time where his disciples saw him do something that was truly amazing, truly beyond what a man could do, as he turned this water into wine. One of the mysteries that I suppose we'll never know is, how did Mary know, right? As she approached him and she says, listen, they don't have any more wine. And we get the sense there with Jesus' response there that he knew that she was expecting him to do something about it. And because he says, why do you involve me? My time has not yet come. Again, he knew that she was asking him to rescue the situation, to do something about it. And again, we don't know how it is that she knew that he could do something. Was she expecting him to do something supernatural? Was she expecting a miracle there? And if so, how did she know that he did miracles? Again, those questions go unanswered. There are a number of theories that take place. But obviously, Jesus' mother knew that there was something special about him. Not everyone knew that at this point, but they were about to find out. Because after what seems a mild kind of protest, Jesus instructs the servants to fill the stone water pots, or the stone jars, with water. Now, these weren't small stone jars. We're told in the text here that they held 20 to 30 gallons each. If you think of a 50-gallon drum and then that being a little smaller, that's a pretty good amount of water. There were 6 of them there. Why did they need that much water? Well, because anytime they ate, they had to wash their hands. They would take something and dip the water out and pour it over their hands to purify their hands. That was according to the traditions of the elders. They had to do that before they ate. And remember, at the wedding feast, they were eating a lot, several times throughout this feast. And so each time they had to take water and pour it on their hands. And each time the servants would have to refresh those water jars and fill them up with water again. The water would have either come from the source of a nearby river, or it could have come from a well. Either way, it would have been much less drinkable or potable than the water we drink. Our water is a lot more purified now than it would have been back then. Remember, Paul reminds Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach's sake, and that's because the water back then does what water in underdeveloped countries do now. It gives them tummy aches, and it makes them sick sometimes. This water would have been that kind of water. And yet Jesus, when he asks them to fill the pots up with water, they fill it to the brim. He says, now draw some water out and take it to the master of the banquet. We don't know the process that took place in the miracle. I'm sure there was some kind of a chemical change that miraculously happened at the time, but what happened, happened. Jesus did turn that water into wine, and when he did, the master of the banquet tasted it and said, wow, this is something else. It wasn't just cheap wine. It wasn't just any wine. It was really good. Jesus turned something that was polluted, something that was barely drinkable, into something that was in their day and in their time considered beautiful. That was the miracle that he did in that situation. Now, can you imagine being the disciples? Put yourself in their shoes for just a minute. Being the disciples who were at this wedding. Many of them had come from John the Baptist and had been a disciple of his, and then they transferred their time and the time that they spent with Jesus. John the Baptist himself had told them, listen, this man is going to be something special. He's God's chosen one. Maybe they had been standing there in the river as Jesus was baptized, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in the form of a dove, and the voice came from heaven, this is my son, do what he says. They still have some questions about him, but they're pretty sure that this man this teacher, this rabbi is special. He's someone that God is with. God is with him in a strong kind of way. And so they're watching to see what he does. To them, it looks like ordinary water in these jars, and then all of a sudden, it's some of the best drink around. That had to have been impressive. That had to have been awe-inspiring, and indeed it was. John, as he writes his gospel, he put 7 signs in his gospel. These are miracles that Jesus did that he considers to be signs. Signs of what? Well, he tells us in the last chapter, or in chapter 20, the second to the last chapter of his book, that he's telling these things because he wants people to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. And so he's writing this to help people see what he saw. And in these times and with these signs that Jesus did, every time he did a miracle, he reinforced the fact that there was something amazing about this person. Something amazing about him that caused them to believe that he wasn't just a man, but that he was himself God in the flesh. And indeed, that's who he was. In verse 11, if you'll take it to that, I know we're there. In verse 11, at the last part of that, this was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Have you ever stopped and thought for a minute about what it looks like to believe? How does that get started? How do you move from unbelief to belief? How do you go from a standpoint where you're doubtful about Jesus and his claims, you're doubtful about God and what he did in this world, to the point to where you believe it with all of your heart? And we get some insight into it here. As Jesus performs this miracle, these disciples who had questions about him before, all of a sudden those questions were answered. Why? Because they saw something supernatural there. Something about him was different. And when they saw supernatural, when they saw he was able to do these incredible things, the Bible says they believed in him. You see, the presence of the supernatural is, when it's there, is strong. And it was there in Jesus' case. We talked about last week the fact that that John portrays Jesus as the light of the world. Jesus claimed that himself. Those were his claims. He says, I am the light of the world. We talked a little bit about what that meant. The fact that Jesus lived the kind of life that brings light to the world, that chases away darkness, pushes it back, and illuminates the things around him, illuminates the path that leads to heaven. And it's what he charges his followers to do as well. He told them in Matthew and in other places, you are the light of the world. You are the ones who, as you follow me, shine a light on a path that leads to the Father, that leads to heaven, that leads from this life and the darkness that's here into eternity where there is no darkness. There is only light. So how do we go about shining that light? How does this passage, how does this text inform us on how we go about shining the light of Jesus? The passage that Robin read for us earlier, if you'll go to that final slide, the passage that Robin read for us earlier from 2 Corinthians, I think, sheds some light on that. It's a much-loved passage because it really communicates what we're doing, what we're about here. Paul uses the analogy. He talks about this light of God, the light that shines out from the presence of God. And he says that we have this light of God in our hearts. It dwells within us, and it's there. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4 that we have this treasure, in other words, the light, the glory of Jesus Christ, in jars of clay. What's the treasure? It's the light of Jesus, the light of God that he puts in there, his glory. What's the jars of clay? It's our bodies, it's us. We have this light in jars of clay so that people can see, those who see will know that it's God working and it's not us. That's where the earlier illustration comes in. The idea that in order for there to be a contrast between God working in us and us working in us, they have to be able to see both. They have to be able to see the contrast, the difference that God makes in our lives. Later on in 2 Corinthians, Paul will say, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. In other words, when people see the weakness in me and realize there's no way Paul could do that on his own, Paul says, exactly, that's right. There's no way I could do this on my own. It's God working through me. How does that work for each and every one of us? How does it work as we seek to shine the light? Tell the story of a friend of mine at Harding in college. There were most of the Bible majors that were a group of friends that I had at Harding were guys who had grown up in the church. They had their very earliest memories on, they remember what it was like to come to the church, to sit in the pew, to get the Cheerios, the whole deal, to go to Bible classes and that kind of thing. It was their life experience. It's how they lived their life. But there were a few, and we always kind of envied those few. There were a few who did not grow up in the church. They grew up in homes that were either neutral in terms of spiritual things or downright hedonistic. And the man I'm talking about, the friend of mine that I'm talking about, grew up in the latter. It was a home that had no use for religion or church or anything along those lines. They were typical worldly folks, his parents were. And that's what he was as a young man. And as a young man, he involved himself in the things that those young men do. He was a hedonist. He basically lived a life that was lived for partying, for the drinking, the drugs, the women, and all of those things that go with it. That was his life, and it was how he lived. And it was, I think he would describe, a time of darkness. He understands, like few of those who were raised in the church can, what it looks like to really live in darkness. We were envious of him sometimes because our last year we lived in apartments, and our apartments were together. And I remember numerous times where he would come running into the apartment and say, guys, I've been reading the Bible, and this is incredible. Did you realize that it said this? And he would have read a Bible story that we've learned about since we were kids. That's amazing. Can you imagine that? And we envied him, getting excited about those stories all over again. What an incredible perspective he brought to that. But that wasn't always his perspective. How did he get there? And he tells a great story. He's got a great witness. He and some friends began playing basketball with a man that they met while they were at one of their hangouts. He brought a basketball. There was an outdoor court, and he said, hey, you guys want to play? And they played basketball together. And they got to do that on a fairly regular basis. They just shot hoops. But as they did that, they got to know him. And as they got to know him, they realized there were some things that were different about his life than their lives. And they started asking questions, talking to him. Hey, you want to go do this? Nah, I got a Bible study I got to get to, so you guys have a good time with that. I'll see you next time we play ball. On down the road that went till the questions began to turn spiritual. And this man knew a lot about spiritual things. And he was able, through those questions, to lead them into a look at who Jesus was and to a look at Scripture. And because of that, he became a dedicated believer in Jesus Christ. And it led him to Harding, to a Bible major, to becoming a Bible major, and then moving beyond. And he's in a counseling ministry now. Incredible story. And again, we see that played over and over and over again. Someone was just light. Just shined light into darkness. They realized that this man wasn't perfect. He wasn't God's gift to the world. He was just a guy who had a belief, a faith in something. And in that, they saw light. Where I want to draw that in terms of this story, the parallel that I want to draw is that light that they saw was supernatural. When they saw Jesus living in this man, when they saw the impact that Jesus had on his life and how it had brought him to the point that he was at that point, they started to wonder if there wasn't maybe something to this. Now, they had heard about faith. In fact, this guy said, my friend said that one of the chief things they talked about when they were smoking marijuana was Jesus, interestingly enough. That set us all back. We had no idea that that's what they talked about, but that's what they talked about. And then this man was able to tell them who Jesus was, really who Jesus was. And when they began to see that this man was different because of how he talked, when they began to see that his life was different, his life was changed by his relationship with Jesus Christ, as they began to see the supernatural, they did what the disciples did. They believed. So how do we move people? How do we move people from unbelief from a stagnant kind of belief? Maybe an awareness back there that there has to be something more in this world than just random events that cause us to come about. And I think a lot of people are. How do you move them from that to a belief in Jesus Christ? And the answer John shares with us is be light. It's a simple answer, but it's complicated at the same time sometimes. Be light. Shine your light, not the light that's you, but the light that's in you from Jesus, into dark places. It means, one, that it's not going to be good enough to just to clean up the public spaces so that people think that everything is good and that you're all put together. It's okay to be a little messy sometimes, because we all are. It's okay to live our lives out in front of people. It's okay to help people realize that, yeah, I make mistakes too. I don't always do or say just the things that I need to say. Because people have already seen that, let's be honest. People have already seen that in us. They know that we're not perfect. They've seen our weaknesses and shortcomings, and frankly, when we try to hide that, it looks hypocritical. It's far better for us to face it, to realize that we're not perfect, that we're not everything that we want to be someday, that God's still working on me, I've still got room to grow, and then let his light shine through that mess. And when people see that, it's likely to trigger in them, in some of them, the same kind of belief that it triggered in the disciples. The same kind of belief that it triggered in my friend. Jesus turned water into wine. And he does the same thing with our lives. He takes our dirty, polluted, may cause you to be sick kind of lives and turns it into something beautiful, something admirable, something that has great taste, great value, and great benefit. That's what he does with us. That's the miracle that repeats itself over and over and over again as Jesus takes this mess and makes it into something beautiful, makes it into something incredible. And as I can share that story with others, that has traction. That allows them to believe far more than just preaching at them, far more than just a Bible study or an invitation to church. All those things are good. Not saying that they're not. Want us to do those things. But first and foremost, we be light. We let our supernatural show. We let God shining through us show, and it can only happen when we're real, when we're not pretending to be something that we're not, when we allow his light to shine through our mess. We have this treasure in jars of clay. If this morning, again, if you realize that darkness is more of where you live than light, if you realize that as you open your eyes spiritually speaking, there is more nothing than there is something, I hope you can see within us, within the brothers and sisters that serve the Lord together here, that there's something more. It's not that we're perfect. It's not that we're put together. It's not that we've got it all figured out. But it's that we've got something amazing inside of us that's shining out. I hope you can see that. And I hope you'll be drawn to that and realize that that same light can shine through your darkness, can give you purpose and meaning, and can allow your life to be used on this earth to his glory and to illuminate that path that leads you through this life and to eternity beyond. That's what we're shooting for. That's what we want. And we beg of you to let us join you in that path and for you to join us on that path, lighting the way ahead to Jesus. If you're a believer who's stepped away from the light, we invite you to come back this morning. We've got a number of people who will be around the auditorium as we sing this next song. They'd love to pray with you about moving back towards the light. If you've got a friend or a relative, someone you know that you'd like for them to pray for, they'd love to do that too. The content of those prayers will not be shared with the congregation unless you specifically ask them to share it. So just use this time to have someone pray with you, to have someone pray over you or for someone else that you know is in need. And if you'd like to become a member of the family of Jesus, if you'd like to turn away from your old life, be baptized, having your sins washed away, and rise to walk in a new life, a life that's characterized by light and virtue, then we'd invite you to do that this morning. However we can help you to draw closer to the light, we'd like to invite you to do that as we stand and sing this song.
Times I fail, still your mercy